All right. I am going to get started as folks keep joining us. I want to welcome you all to Queering Nature, a Pride Month panel brought to you by National Audubon Society's LGBTQIA++ affinity group. My name is Sarah Hugis. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm coming to you today from the Dawnland Confederacy of the Wabanaki, or more specifically, Abenaki land, now known as Vermont. I just want to take a moment to remember that the land on which myself and the panelists work and recreate on is stolen Native land. If you're interested in learning what Native land you're living on or working or recreating on, you can visit native-land.ca. And it's a great map that just shows all of the different Native territories. And with that, we hope that your Pride Month has been wonderful so far and full of celebration and reflection. Today, we have a special topic. We're going to be talking about the relationship between queerness and nature. Because for far too long, the natural and social sciences have mobilized the idea of nature and the natural world to reinforce Western European norms of heterosexuality and gender conformity. And still today, the idea of heterosexuality and cisgender identity as natural is weaponized against queer and trans people, and especially BIPOC queer and trans people. Thank you so much for everybody who's tuning in today. It's really exciting. And of course, thank you to our panelists. We're so lucky to have a wide range of expertise and life experiences represented tonight. And with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our amazing panelists tonight. So we have Gwen Causer. Gwen Causer is a teacher naturalist and communications coordinator for Audubon, Vermont. Gwen's first love in nature is botany, and she does most of her birding by ear. She's passionate about creating equitable access to nature for communities not traditionally included in the environmental movement. She works closely with the Pride Center of Vermont and Outright Vermont to host monthly Pride hikes for queer Vermonters and allies. And I can say that these hikes are so fun, so thank you, Gwen. And we are also joined tonight by Andrew Giles. And Andrew writes poetry, reviews, and creative nonfiction, and has work published in various newspapers, journals, and anthologies. He is the founder of Graham Farm, a permaculture project, creative residency, and safe space for queer folk and their allies in the mountain paradise of Taverga, Asturias, northern Spain. And you can check out his background. Some of that is from the mountains of northern Spain. It's beautiful. And we're also joined by another Audubon employee, Haymar Lim. Haymar serves as a liaison between Richardson Bay Audubon Center and the many individuals and organizations that make up the community there. They work on volunteer-powered habitat restoration projects, community science programs. They manage the native plant nursery, community outreach, and provide staff support for the various other needs at the center. And last but not least, we're joined tonight by Kate Sandilands, and Kate is a writer and scholar in the environmental humanities. She's most well known for her conception of queer ecology. She's currently a professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. And with that, I'm going to ask my panelists our first question so that we can hear a little bit more about the amazing, important work that they're doing. So my first question for you all is, how did you come to do the work that you do, and how has queerness informed that journey? And who feels ready?
Sure, I don't mind kicking off, Sarah, if that's okay.
That sounds great. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I just wanted to take everyone a little bit through what's more a personal journey, really, for me. I brought up in a rural environment, but as a queer kid, that never was a particularly comfortable place. And moving to the urban was really, as it is for many queer folk, a step away from homophobia, from small town mentalities, and a step towards, in the urban, acceptance or like-minded folk, or a nightlife, or anything that really felt like I belonged. But over the years, I realized I didn't really belong in an urban environment. I didn't really feel that an urban capitalist LGBTQ culture, as plural as it may be, was for me. So I wanted to create a safe space for myself, like-minded folk, a place of work, a place of meditation, a place of healing in a rural environment. So that's how I came to be here in the mountains in Spain. And that's just really an introduction of my personal journey.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. Is somebody ready to go next?
Sure, I can go.
Great, thanks, Kate.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. I'm coming to you from the traditional, unceded, and ongoing territories of the Penelakut, Lamulki, Tsawwassen, and other Coast Salish speaking peoples. I am actually on a small island, a small rural island, and I understand Andrew's description of his journey from, in my case, from a small city to a large city, and now I'm back living in a rural space. And the idea that that rural places are inherently hostile to LGBTQ plus individuals, and urban spaces are inherently welcoming has always frustrated me as a story. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you have to say about that, Andrew. My own story is I'm an academic, so the story I'm going to tell is an academic story. I was doing my PhD in sociology in the 1990s. And that was sort of a very heady period for the rise of for the ascendancy of queer theory. So I was heavily influenced by Michel Foucault and alike, and I found but I found a sort of ill fit between my interests, my being as a queer person, and my interest in my being as an environmental and specifically environmental feminist activist. The queer part and the green part were not fitting together terribly well. That might, that in some ways makes me feel, I frequently feel old. But in the 1990s, even ecofeminism was a relatively new conversation. And a lot of the ecofeminist conversation was, this is a history that happens time and time again in feminism, and in LGBTQ plus politics. The dominant white groups, and in this case, dominant white heterosexual groups, speak first and are not necessarily willing to offer up a lot of space for other conversations. So I found that in sort of the ecofeminist universe, there wasn't a lot of conversation about queer politics or even lesbian politics, which was surprising given the very rich tradition of lesbian ecological activism in the 1970s and 80s. In any case, because I know our time is short, I was asked in the 1990s, specifically in 1994, to write an article, any article that somehow brought together the terms queer and nature. And this was an issue of the Faculty of Environmental Studies, York University's critical graduate journal, Undercurrents. So this is, so you look at the bottom, you'll see it was 1994. And to the best of my knowledge, this was the very, very first publication to bring together queer and nature into the same conversation. And it, I think of all of the issues of Undercurrents, it's the one that sold out. So I'm just gonna show you something else. You think I would be better at the Zoom technology after teaching online for a year. This is my article that I wrote in that piece. And it was extremely preliminary. It was really an experiment. What would happen if I put these terms queer and nature together? And the article makes me cringe more than a little bit now. It was 30 years ago, so I sincerely hope some things have changed to make it seem cringeworthy. But in that article, I raised a couple of points. I just reread the article a couple of days ago in preparation. a couple of points that I was actually quite surprised. It's like, oh yeah, that's still kind of true. So I'm just going to sort of give you those points as an opening, and then I will back off, and I look forward to seeing how those points converse with what other people have to say. So the first point is that heterosexism has had a huge impact, both on how Euro-Western modernity understands nature, and also on how that same social order is metastasizing to create the environmentally destructive conditions in which we currently find ourselves. So patriarchal, heterosexual, anti-ecological capitalism is actually not just a list of terms. It's actually quite a meaningful, category and destructive one. And the second is that queering nature and ecology isn't just about finding examples of finding sexual diversity in the more than human world, although that can be a whole lot of fun. And personally, I want to come back as a dioecious mulberry tree or something. It is also about, queering ecology is also about, it's a political term. It's also about challenging those kinds of relationships. So I'll show you one more image. This book came out in 2010, and it includes a whole raft of really, really brilliant people, Stacey Limo, Andal Gosen, Noel Sturgeon, and it actually, I think if you're interested in some of these ideas about queer ecology and queer nature, this is a good place to go, because you get a bunch of really smart people's opinions on that topic. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I think that I also speak for most of the panel when I say thank you for writing those zines back in the 90s and starting this conversation about queerness and nature and ecology.
It was actually the editors, Michael Brazalier and Shauna O'Connor. It was their idea.
Great. And then we still have Gwen and Hamar to hear from. Great, Gwen is going to take it. Thanks, Gwen.
Sure, I can go ahead. So my journey, I've been working for Audubon for 15 years now, and I've been started off teaching kids. And it's just in the past 3 years ago, we started the Pride Hikes here in Vermont. And it was a collaboration between the Pride Center of Vermont and Outright Vermont. And that experience of creating this space in the outdoors, it was very intentionally a space that's safe, inclusive for the queer community, was something that wasn't happening before. And it's something that it's really been the most powerful program I've ever had the privilege of being a part of with Audubon. And I've been here for a while. It's interesting that, like, reflecting upon the question of how does my queerness inform that? And, you know, when I was launching Pride Hikes in conjunction with these other partners, I was really approaching it from the space of an ally. And I wasn't really, since my 20s, I had a sense of my own queerness, but, you know, I got married, I had a kid. My kid is now the transgender college student. And so that has really informed she's really helped me understand my own identity in a different way. But the process of holding that space with the Pride Hikes every single month for 3 years and doing that in collaboration with these organizations that at their core are about radical inclusion really gave me the space myself to really examine my own queer identity and to, you know, recognize that like back in the 90s, it was a matter of like, you need to pick a side. And, but I've always been drawn to those spaces, been drawn to those communities. I lived in Seattle in Capitol Hill and, you know, joined the 7-Star Women's Kung Fu and, you know, always marched in the pride parades. But it wasn't until I was a part of being accepting and having that sense of inclusion that I was able to see myself in that way. and really embrace my own queer identity. So, and that's, this is the first opportunity that I've had to really talk about that in this kind of setting. So I want to thank you all for giving me that space.
Thank you so much for sharing, Gwen. And last but not least, for our first question is Hamar.
Hi, everyone. So my journey kind of started off, or, there are multiple beginning points anyone can pick, but I suppose a more relevant point started off when I had just graduated from university, finished my undergraduate degree in biology, and kind of came out into this sort of new world economy where you can't just like get a great entry-level job coming straight out of your undergraduate position. And I had a lot of time at home to kind of just sit and think and really sit with myself, and a lot of the processing kind of came into some pretty typical feelings of people in this generation of existential dread with climate anxiety. And in general, I was also processing the sort of intersection of my queer identity, which I was suppressing very much, and my parents' sort of like biracial conservative social values. And in many ways, I kind of sat under this sort of pressure cooker of all of these, giant ideas or giant phenomena that are really facing us in this time. And I really kind of thought, so I went into my undergrad just because I was fed that kind of, story of everyone goes into college and that is what you do to get yourself on the path of success. And coming out of it, I figured out that academia wasn't for me, for one. But then the other thing was that everything felt so slow, and like I was under such stasis for so much time that I eventually had to just, break out and be like, no, I need to escape this. So I started volunteering with a community-based organization called the Village Community Boathouse in New York City. And their whole thing was, everybody thinks of New York City as a super urban environment that just not nature, but actually the waterways of New York City are your waterways. They belong to everyone, and they're an inherent part of nature that people just don't have a conception of living within this urban environment. So I started volunteering with them, teaching people how to row on the Hudson River for free. And that really just got me into this groove of thinking about community organizing as the way to actually address problems, because all of these other things like climate change and capitalism and things like that were way over anything that I had that much individual influence to change. But I felt community organizing was a way that I could personally put forth some kind of individual action and feel empowered. And that actually led me to do a couple of years of AmeriCorps, one on Cape Cod, and then one in Northern California doing water quality monitoring with the Yurok tribe. And that was where I was really able to sort of break away from just being in this sort of notion of you need to be on one path to living a sort of like successful life and having a good career. And then I was able to go ahead and leave and open my mind and be away from like the traditional influences of my parents and things like that, and really start to embrace my own queer identity. And that's when I started to notice that there was almost an inherent clash between the conservation movement as it was and my identity as a queer person. And for a long time, I actually thought, well, if I'm going to be an effective environmentalist or conservationist, I have to learn how to work with people in power to do things like pass conservation easements on landowners' land or things like that. I have to form those relationships with people in power, which tend to be people following sort of like heteronormative identity standards, right? And the longer I was away from home and I had a little bit more room to do individual expression, the more I really sunk my teeth into the community organizing side of things. And the more I was like, actually, that's all wrong. And limiting my definition of environmentalism and environmental progress to the things that the people that already have power will let us do is so flawed. So in many ways, my journey has been slowly kind of peeling back all of these layers of repression. And my queer identity has just really helped inform my general approach to conservation now, which needs, clearly everyone knows that it needs to be bigger, it needs to be more inclusive, and it needs to happen really, really soon because all of these threats are imminent and looming. So anyways, I'm kind of rambling on now, but that's been my journey.
Thank you so much for sharing, Hamar. I want to give you all a moment just in case anybody want to respond to anything that any of the panelists had said. And then I will move into question number 2. So I'll just give you all about 10 seconds if you would like to jump in. Great. It looks like we're going to move into our next question. So my next question for you all is, why is queerness a necessary part of our understanding to nature? And I do feel like Hamar was just getting into that when they were talking about their conservation work. Anyone is welcome to take a first stab at this question. Uh-oh, looks like.
Do you want me to jump in again? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that would be fantastic.
If we were going in a strict order, which is not very queer, but anyway, never mind. Why is queerness a necessary part of our understanding of nature? Well, firstly, queer is nature. It is natural. And that's something that I need to feel and I haven't always felt. So that's really important for me to say, first of all, I think. Secondly, as a writer, aside from being a permaculture farmer, I'm a writer as well, and I write about what I call a queer history of outsiders. And I think, although all of us here might know it, being queer in nature is not new. It's ancient. There's a network of queer folk across cultures and across times who have existed within rural communities. And I think that also, I need to say that for myself as well, because I live in a very isolated place as a queer person. And I need to feel like there's a network of people, even if I don't see them, especially because we continue to be going through a pandemic, which has been within itself quite challenging. I need to feel like I'm within a network, and that doesn't need to be a network in this time even. It can be a network online, on the page, in history. But if you look at writers like Edward Carpenter, for example, he wrote very beautifully and very convincingly about queer folk in history and culture as crucial members of small rural communities, shaman, healers, two-spirit people in Native American culture as well, which I think they're here with us always. All of those people in history and time are here with us and with me at Greyhame Farm. So necessary, intrinsic, of our understanding of nature, only in an emotional and historical sense. But in, you know, as I know Kate and Hamar and Gwen will also say, in so many other senses as well. So that's where I would leave it for now. But essential, intrinsic are the two words I would use.
I like those two words, Andrew. Thanks for sharing. We can go in our order. If Kate, I see Kate unmuted, if you would like to go next.
Moving gaily forward. I guess one of my questions, I've been thinking about that question for, well, 30 years. And it sounds like I'm hedging the point, but I think it's important for us to think about, what do we mean when we say queer? There is, you know, on the one hand, there's the sense that Andrew just described very eloquently. There are all kinds of traditions in different parts of the world, including within, you know, sort of the belly of the white colonial capitalist beast, of queer, there's queer pastoral, you know, in Virgil, you know, there's the whole pastoral tradition in which queer sexuality was actually celebrated in ancient Greek culture. So it's on the one hand, it is absolutely important and necessary to look for examples of human sexual diversity that incorporated in which nature was integral. So it wasn't that it has not always been the case that urban equals queer and rural equals straight. There is, as Andrew points out, a very rich tradition. It's also important to think about the way in which heterosexism has pervaded the rise of Euro-Western science. And books like Evolution's Rainbow and I've just forgotten the one by Bruce Bagamiel, Biological Exuberance. They have really done, they did a lot of work to correct some of those assumptions, but the assumption that the only natural sexuality in animals, obviously plants have always been queer, that I see the botanist smiling at that one. The idea that the highest form or the best form of sexuality in nature is heterosexual has actually obscured biological understanding for quite a long time. For one example is the case of the lesbian gulls. I believe it was on the west coast of Canada. There was a group of seagulls in which the ornithologists observed what they considered to be really quite abnormal numbers of females courting and having sex with each other. And it was assumed that it must be as a result of some form of environmental contamination. That was abhorrent and unnatural behavior, because obviously it was going to get in the way of their ability to reproduce the next generation. As it turns out, the world is full of lesbian seagulls. So take that, Jonathan Livingston. So that's another way in which it's important to think about queerness in relationship to the natural world. We cannot begin with the assumption that any particular kind of sexuality is natural. And in fact, if you look in the glorious diversity of the world, you see not just heterosexual, but asexual and polysexual and changing over time. The world is a glorious sea of erotic complication. But the one that really interests me is the idea of that queer also has to be understood as a political category. It's not just the sum total of lesbian, bisexual, trans, two-spirit, asexual, etc. individuals. It's a political category, and it's a political category that we need to, in our everyday lives, such as Hamar described in their emergence into sort of a queer version of conservation. that queer is something that we take into our daily practice as a way of disrupting some of these destructive heterosexual assumptions. So for me, at the end of the day, queer is not just a descriptive category. It's a political category that challenges these destructive heterosexual institutions. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, thank you for your answer. And yes, thank God for those lesbian gulls. I love that line. Hey, Mar, would you like to speak next? I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I just want to jump off of what Kate was saying, because it resonates a lot with a lot of the, this traditional, not even traditional, it's just like the kinds of things that people will say when they'll argue like, oh, but biology says that things need to be this way. And I was always like, well, as a biology major, actually, you're very wrong about the way development works. But that sort of aside, it just goes into the fact that science, many people sort of treat science as this completely empirical thing that has no biases at all. And, the people on all sides of the political spectrum are guilty of saying, well, the science, it kind of, the more you kind of comprehend science, the more you realize there's a lot of influence from the scientists. And the interesting thing to me about conservation in particular, which is, I'll speak to that since it's a field that I have more experience with. The science on the conservation side has been a science of, in general, and this is more in the American environmentalist context, it has been a tradition of othering, basically. It has been, the people that have kind of like founded this field had their particular notions about what beauty was and about what nature was. And to people like John Muir, they didn't see indigenous people as part of that equation. And specifically in the California context, we're seeing a lot of the negative consequences of basing a lot of our environmental practices on this othering of people. So the big example here in California is the fires, right? A lot of forest management used to be, oh my gosh, look at our beautiful, pristine forests. We like them natural, whatever that definition of natural meant to those people. And that meant, let's put out all of the fires. And there is this long, long tradition of indigenous people managing forests in California with fire. That totally was, the people just were like, that's something that we're not going to pay attention to, because why would you ever burn a forest or something like that? And now all of our forests are completely overloaded with excess fuels, and we're facing increased temperatures and wildfires every year that are just covering everything in smoke. And anyways, it's just, in general, I think that the notion of queerness, by its almost literal definition of the word, is like outside the norm or strange or other. It really resonates with me, because all of those other perspectives are what we need to actually inform our science to be better and to actually understand nature better, and redefine nature as something that is more balanced. Because if one of the basic scientific principles is replicating your study in as many ways as possible to be able to actually see that it's valid. And if you're not replicating it under different perspectives, and you only have people that see it one way, you're just going to have very flawed definitions of nature.
Thank you, Amar. And Gwen, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking of flipping it around, because my experience with the Pride hikes and being queer is about being queer in nature. And that experience has been such a powerful thing. to have that visibility of, because it's not, you know, there's an idea about what it looks like to be someone who enjoys nature, what that active outdoors person looks like. And to go into the woods with a group of 25 queer people on the trails is really powerful when you're passing people on the trail, and just shifting that perception of who belongs in nature, of who nature belongs to. And then the other thing that happens on the trail is like being enveloped in nature. There is a kind of trust that happens during these pride hikes that I do not experience anywhere else. And, you know, people show up and people don't know each other, and they get on the trail, and the conversations that happen in nature are just, they just go deep right away. And there's just this foundational understanding that the people who are here are going to understand what my experience is about. They're going to listen deeply to what's going on for me. And I just have been so honored to be a witness and part of holding that space in nature, which is so different from you know, how I often find myself in a position to sort of mediate people's experience of nature. And this was really clear to me. During the pandemic, we actually were able to do a forest bathing class. And I participated in that as a participant, not as a leader. And I did this at the Green Mountain Audubon Center, in a place that I've been teaching kids and adults for 15 years. And to just experience this forest bathing on that land in a way where it's completely sensory. And it made me realize just how much I'm mediating people's experience of nature. And that's not what happens during the pride hikes. You know, like I'm just there, I'm part of it, and I'm part of that community. And it's just a very different way of thinking about how to connect to community and how to be in nature in the queer space.
Thanks, Gwen, for sharing. Like the last question, I'll just leave a 10-second space to see if any hands go up if you'd like to respond to any of the other panelists. And then I will move on to our next question.
I would kind of like to hear from Andrew about the space that you create where you are, because I'd like to, you know, because I heard a little bit of that, and you know, if you'd like to talk about that some more.
So, Gwen, do you think I should describe a little bit where I am and then kind of the things that we've been doing here? Would that work for you? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I would love to hear that.
Well, so as Sarah said, I'm in the north of Spain, which is sort of very green, lush, mountainous region with quite a healthy bear and wolf population. So it's quite curious in Europe in that sense, although happily, the bear and wolf populations here are healthy in other parts of Europe, like Italy as well. That's a different conversation. So I'll move on. It's a tiny community. Spain historically emptied out of its rural spaces into urban spaces. So there are lots of what I hear called pueblos fantasmas, ghost villages, pretty much empty. It's where people go for the weekend to see their grandparents. It's where people go on holiday, maybe, but it's not a place where that many people live full time. It can be quite brutal. The winters are very harsh. There's not a network, as I talked about networks before. There's, you know, in terms of queer folk, there's certainly not a queer community here, although at Greyhame Farm, we're trying to build that so people can come here, have come here, and use it as a safe space. It's a place of work, it's a place of learning, it's a place of foraging, it's a place of building, it's a place of cutting down wood for firewood, of clearing land for growing, of renovating buildings, of trying to learn about permaculture practices, trying to learn from the neighbors, whether they like it or not. Don't always love it. Trying to create community in a place that is not historically queer. Does that answer your question, Gwen?
Yeah, no, I appreciate getting a fuller sense of that.
Thank you so much.
All right, our next question just goes a little bit deeper about how the non-human world enriches our understanding and helps us celebrate queerness. So the question is, how can a mutual relationship with the non-human world help us celebrate queerness and enrich queerness?
Are we going in order, Sarah?
Go ahead.
Yeah, shall I?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think I think it's obvious that I speak of emotions and I speak of practice and work quite a lot. I think that's the most fruitful way for me personally to speak. Although I find it so useful to listen to Kate and Hamar and Gwen to really sort of give body to the things that I'm thinking. So I'm so grateful for that. In terms of a mutual relationship, I think the one thing we haven't really spoken about, which is a really present factor in many queer people's experiences, is mental health or neurodiversity or mental difference or mental illness, the latter of which I'm not a big fan of as a term, but certainly, you know, we all experience vulnerability, we all experience precarity as part of our life experience. And I think it's, certainly I have experienced that, and I can see my colleagues, my partners nodding, and you know, I can feel that. So that sense of vulnerability and precarity is something that nature feels too, in my opinion. The planet is in the sense of emergency. I share that with the planet. That's my mutual relationship with the non-human, is that I'm a steward of this land, and it's my honor to be here and to try and you know, work with nature as permaculture would have it, to produce something from the land, and not to take from the land, but to be a steward of a space where humans have been stewards for hundreds of years. And hopefully, you know, although Hamar did say that, you know, we've got a lot of work to do, and quite quickly, hopefully offer something for future queer generations. So that, in a sense, I mean, I don't know if celebrate's the right verb, because, you know, going back to Hamar again, we have this sense of climate anxiety to add to other anxieties and depressions and you know, other experiences that we all have. So maybe not celebrate, but we've, you know, there's work to do, and we're all doing that. That's exciting, I think, and that feels, you know, something that we can do.
Thanks, Andrew. Going in our order, Kate would be next. Go ahead.
Thank you. That was a great answer, Andrew. Thank you. I love the idea that thinking deeply about our enmeshment in the more than human world gives us a sense of our vulnerability, and not just human vulnerability, but our shared vulnerability. I think that idea of queer community, sort of beyond the heterosexual nuclear family, beyond this idea of liberal individualism, beyond pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and that sort of normative heterosexual individual that Hamar has already referred to, but rather to approach being in the more than human world with a sense of shared vulnerability. Opens you up to a different experience of what's going on and a different response to it. So rather than conquer climate change, master climate change? What would it feel like to actually imagine ourselves as deeply vulnerable to climate change? How does that sense of humility affect our ability to have relationships with other animals, with plants, with microorganisms, and possibly even with viruses? I guess so I love that. Thank you for that, for giving us that, Andrew. The other thing that I would want to say is that I think that the minute you start to look closely at other beings, at other species, at other animals, other plants, even the ones that you live with on an everyday basis, like Hamar, a friend of mine, just wrote a paper about Tree of Heaven, which is everywhere in New York. And thinks of them as a very queer tree, by the way. But just look, if you start to look closely at the beings with whom we are surrounded, and you start to appreciate sort of their ways of going about doing things, going about doing sexual things in particular. It's also a deeply humbling experience. Like, how could I possibly have imagined that reproductive nuclear heterosexual families are the best and the only way of going about doing things? I mentioned mulberries earlier. I have a bit of an obsession with mulberries because they're totally cool. Some of them are monoecious, meaning that they have male and female parts, male and female flowers on the same plant. Some of them are dioecious, meaning that they're separate parts on separate plants, and some of them are both, and sometimes they self-fertilize and sometimes they don't self-fertilize depending on different environmental conditions, and the trees can change their dominant efflorescence over time in response to environmental conditions, and they produce bazillions of berries all over the place. Talk about biological exuberance. Like, if you've ever seen a sort of a big mulberry tree in full berry, it's quite an extraordinary experience. So how humbling to look at that mulberry tree and say, how could I possibly imagine that the heterosexual nuclear family is the best way of going about doing things when there's this?
Thanks so much for sharing, Kate. I've been thinking a lot about how we define, successful reproduction, and often it is, the male needs to impregnate as many females as possible, and it's just between the two of them. But there are so many different examples of co-parenting and just other ways of existing that I have enjoyed reading about. So thanks for speaking to that. Hamar or Gwen, who would like to go next?
I can go.
Great, thanks, Hamar.
I just want to bounce off of what both Andrew and Kate were saying with regards to the mental health side of things and how being in nature has this sort of like humbling experience. And I don't know, there's this sense of smallness that I have when I can go outside and be in something that I feel that I can separate out so many of the social norms that people have to put up with on their day in their daily lives. And I think that one of the ways that I've found sort of refuge in that, and beyond sort of just temporary relief from things that are happening in our society, a solution and a path forward is building community, doing things in nature, kind of like what I'm sure Andrew experiences on the farm, where it particularly it resonates particularly with me as part of the trans community, but really as part of the any queer identity, the notion of visibility and changing the perception, like Gwen was talking about earlier, and feeling like I belong in that space and having that sort of emotional resonance with nature it makes it so that building a community is a way that I think queer people can thrive in nature. I've had several experiences where, I've only recently, or relatively recently, started being a visible queer person in the environmental field. And I've already had other people come up to me and be like, I previously felt like I had to suppress this part of myself. I had to, be something that fit in a mold to be in nature. And these two ideas are just so contradictory to each other. But when you start building that community and people feel empowered, then people start challenging all of these other things that are what is inherently limiting progress, in my opinion. I just think that nature really provides a great platform for people to not only, go and get a little bit of mental health restoration, but, to embrace that and take that and apply it back to our human society and be like, hey, well, what is it that we can learn from this and learn about how we can exist happily and, well in this, that we can make the world what it needs to be. I think that so much of the way we interact, and I keep saying we generally, right? But so much of how people interact with the world is based on these limitations that we set in our minds. And when you see someone doing something and you see that, oh, that person looks like me, or that person is queer like me, then it suddenly takes something that's impossible and makes it, oh, that's a reality. And that's the kind of momentum that I think we need to make our environmental movement successful going into the future.
Yeah, that's so true. And when you're talking about this, I'm thinking about, like, the reason I'm doing this kind of work is just to transform the whole world. It's not about just creating these pride hikes where it's this affinity space. It's like, I've also had the opportunity to work and transform how we think about inclusion of the queer community in all of our programs. So, something that we did, we invited Outright Vermont to come in and do a Gender 101 training for all of the Audubon Vermont staff. And so that's our conservation folks, that's all the summer camp staff, all of the interns. And to see over the course of 3 years, or I guess it's been 4 years since we did that training, to see how our practices have changed. Like, I was watching my colleague when we have introductory circles where we share names and we share pronouns, and just, I've seen Debbie evolve how she talks about what pronouns are, and with all different ages, like preschoolers, all different ages. And it just feels so natural now. It feels so welcoming. And just to see how fluid and easily the kids are able to understand it and able to recognize that in themselves in a way that validates them when they're out in nature, in a way that, like, you just don't have an awareness if you don't have an intentionality about it. And so, bringing that to all of the Audubon network, which has a huge reach, is part of what I feel really honored to be able to do as part of this queer affinity group that is hosting this panel. And, working with my colleagues to do things like look at the transition policy for employees at across the whole network. I mean, there's just so many different ways when you're thinking about queer nature that are not just about being in nature, they're about changing the systems that we have here. And, I spoke about being a parent of a trans young adult. And, like, I just have a fierce mama bear kind of like, I need to change things, and I'm going to do everything in my power to change everything I can touch. And so that motivates me in a way that like beyond my own identity is very powerful. You know, and like I think about the kind of issues around safety that come up with folks who show up on the Pride hikes. And I've been hosting Pride hikes for at least 1.5 years when I actually experienced something like this with my kid walking in a park in Burlington, where we came across somebody when we were in the woods who was wearing a shirt that Ella was like, well, what do you mean by that? And this person just went, this is someone who is a neighbor of mine, who I've known for a long time, didn't know their political beliefs, and just doubled down in invalidating Ella's identity to the point where I did not feel safe being in the woods. And I had not had that experience before. And so there is a lot of change that needs to happen, even in this bubble that I think I live in. And so I'm honored to be working alongside all of you to do that.
I think Gwen brings a great segue to our last question, since we only have 2 minutes left. So I think only one person could, or 2 people could respond. But what work remains to be done? And even more, what can we do to support the work that is happening? Yeah, if anybody would like to jump in these last minutes. If folks need to jump off the Zoom, then that's okay. But I would love to hear a little bit more from our panelists if you can hang on a minute.
I'm going
I'll
to
just speak really quickly. Oh no.
Here,
No,
Please, Kate,
go.
please. I'd love to hear what you've got to say, please.
I'm going to keep it very short. We need to center the voices of cutie BIPOC authors in thinking about queer natures. I'm thinking particularly of experiences like Christian Cooper's, and I am sharing another screen with you. This is a wonderful article. It's called Black Lives, Blackbirds and the Unfinished Work of Queer Ecologies. And in there, also responding to one of the questions that was in the Q&A, are several authors of both fiction and nonfiction who explore queer ecologies from a specifically cutie BIPOC position. Sorry, Andrew.
No, I just feel what Gwen has just said and what you've said, Kate, are so crucial. And I don't feel that anything I could say would be more important. You know, just more queer folk in small sustainable communities, more access for young queer folk to know a safe space exists for them. But, you know, I resonate with what Kate and Gwen and also Hamar have said. So thank you so much.
I also just want to take a moment to say thank you so much to our panelists for taking time, and we have so loved hearing your responses, and I know that your responses are helping people who are still figuring things out or just starting out in the environmental field and trying to work out how their identity fits into that kind of workplace. And yeah, I'm excited about the work that's being done. I know that more needs to happen. And I am just so glad to know that there are folks like you pushing forward. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. And with that, good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
you,
Sarah.
for your answers.